Multi-hazards, all about communities.
Can the environment be racist? No, but those with power can use it to further marginalize racialized communities. Industries, landfills, and other large and small-scale projects are seldom put into affluent white neighborhoods by the government and corporations, but most often where Indigenous, Black, and Brown people live. Today, the Multi-Hazards podcast features Dr. Ingrid Waldron, professor at McMaster University, author of There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, and co-producer of the documentary film of the same name on Netflix. Join us as we discuss environmental racism and how communities and their allies are fighting for environmental justice. Hello, dear listeners. Today we feature a wonderful conversation with Dr. Ingrid Waldron. But first, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of the First Nations groups who have inhabited this land since time immemorial. This area near me, also known as Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. So my guest for today is Dr. Ingrid Waldron. She has an MA from the University of London and a PhD from the University of Toronto. She is the Hope Chair in Peace and Health in the Global Peace and Social Justice Program in the Faculty of Humanities at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Waldron is the author of There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities, Fernwood Publishing, which was turned into a 2020 Netflix documentary of the same name and was co-produced by Waldron, actor Elliott Page, Ian Daniel, and Julia Sanderson, and directed by Page and Daniel. Dr. Waldron is the founder and director of the Environmental Noxiousness, Racial Inequities, and Community Health Project, the Enrich Project, which inspired the Federal Private Members Bill, a national strategy respecting environmental racism and environmental justice, Bill C-230. Bill C-230 was introduced in the House of Commons in Canada on February 26, 2020 by MP Lenore Zam and approved at second reading on March 24, 2021, and at amendments on June 21, 2021. Dr. Waldron also co-founded the Anti-Environmental Racism Coalition, which has brought together organizations in the environment and climate change sector across Canada to collaborate on projects and share expertise and resources to address environmental racism and climate change inequities in Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities in Canada. She's also a member of the Board of Directors at Research Canada. All right. You're in for an inspiring conversation today. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. So it's another episode of Multi-Hazards here today, and welcome everyone. I have a very special guest, Dr. Ingrid Waldron from McMaster University. So it's great to see you, Ingrid, and thank you for being on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing really well, thank you. It's a beautiful day outside. Yes, I'm really great. How are you?
I'm doing fine too. We're having a rainstorm here, but every day is this different.
Okay.
Yeah. So now you wrote an eye-opening book, and I actually have a copy right beside me from Simon Fraser University, and it's called There's Something in the Water, Environmental Racism in Indigenous and Black Communities. And then you co-produced the documentary movie that came out later with the same name. Now we're going to talk about the themes you raised in the book and film. But first of all, to start off, the question I typically ask all my guests is, how are you, Ingrid? And the people around you coping during this seemingly never-ending pandemic?
Yeah, I don't think none of us thought it would last this long, but emotionally it's changed for me. Like everybody else, in March of last year, there was a bit of terror, as I did what I was told to do, which was wash my groceries. I was obsessed with washing my grocery packages. There was one point very early on when I was just afraid to just go out. I thought I would just catch it in the air, right? I remember those times. It's very strange. But there are people who, many people who did not cope as well as some of us did. My lifestyle as a professor, and most professors, is that you work from home a lot. Unless you're teaching a class or you have meetings, many of us work from home, perhaps most of the week. So the isolation, I guess, and the sense of confinement that a lot of people felt, I didn't necessarily feel, because I am accustomed to working alone, working independently, working from home. So, there are people who had really serious mental health problems from this. I can't say I did. I can say that after the initial shock, like everyone else, the terror, perhaps in March and April, I kind of settled into things, and I was always hopeful that things would change. They have not really. I mean, they've gotten better. We're still in it, which is shocking, but I've been able to cope with it better.
Right. Yeah, it's a very hard time. I had a colleague whose husband worked at a hospital, and he said it's going to probably last 2 years. And this was like right in the beginning. So I guess that helped. It helped me psychologically think, okay, this might be 2 years. Prepare.
Yeah.
I don't know how he knew, but yeah.
Wow, he's right. Yeah.
So now there's this buzzword, and I was just thinking this might be like a very famous word in the future, where we can actually go into our search engine and there'll be so many results that come up. But environmental racism, that is a very key word nowadays, and that's what we're talking about. And now, what exactly is it, and how has your journey, your background led you into this topic?
I'm glad that you said that it's a key word now. It certainly wasn't in Canada or in Nova Scotia, where I was teaching at Dalhousie back in 2012 when I started. I had so many journalists ask me what it was, what is environmental racism, never heard of it. And just members of the general public didn't get it. So when you say that it's a key word now, I'm happy to hear that, but I also agree, based on people who reach out to me wanting me to do talks or workshops on environmental racism. I'm really happy that there's more awareness. Environmental racism is about the disproportionate location of polluting industries and other environmentally dangerous projects in Indigenous communities and other racialized communities. So it means that these are communities that are typically selected by government, by industry, for the siting of environmentally dangerous projects. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that these communities often lack political power. They're typically low income, they're non-white, they often live in out of the way or isolated places, whether it be on reserves or, in the case of, for example, African Nova Scotians, in isolated areas, rural areas. And they often don't have a political voice, right? They're often not heard by government. So it's the combination and the intersection of socioeconomic status, geography in terms of where they live, poverty, and not having political clout or social clout or economic clout, to the extent that they're often ignored when they bring up issues of environmental racism or challenge government to address it. I was approached back in the spring of 2012 by an environmental activist in Nova Scotia who wanted me to take on a project on environmental racism, and I had no idea what it was when he approached me. He found me through a health agency that I was collaborating with on another project. That project was about gentrification in the African Nova Scotian community in the north end of Halifax. And the health agency said, you might want to talk to Ingrid about this this environmental racism project, because she's involved in the African Nova Scotian community. So when we met, I met with this activist. I just said, I've never heard this term, and I'm very hesitant to conduct a research project about a term I've never heard of. And it's a strange term, I thought. And I thought, well, like a lot of people, how can the environment be racist? It didn't make any sense to me. And I'm coming from somebody with a background in sociology, but absolutely no expertise in environmental issues. My doctoral work and my postdoctoral work had focused on the mental health issues of racialized people. So this was just not something I was even thinking about. Never considered myself to be an environmentalist. To be honest, had no interest in this field, had no interest in environmental issues. So after he explained it to me, I still thought it's still weird, but I said to myself, well, it's ultimately a health issue, because people who don't want a particular project in their community are probably worried about the health impacts like cancer. And I'm a health researcher, so that interests me that it is a health issue. What also interested me is the populations that environmental racism impacts: Indigenous communities, Black communities, communities I had been working with. So that interested me. The fact that as a sociologist focused on race and ethnicity, it would provide me with an opportunity to work with racialized communities. And then I said to myself, this seems really challenging. It's not only a new topic for me, but I think I can learn something from this. The challenge excited me because it meant that I would really have to think about what I needed to do to create real impacts on the ground. And of course, it's very political. And while I have felt that all of my projects were really interesting, I never felt that they were that political, or certainly as political as this topic. So all of those things attracted me to it, even though I was hesitant, because I said to myself, I do not have the right background for this. Doesn't one have to be an environmental scientist, is what I thought to myself. I said, I'm so far away from an environmental scientist. I know nothing about pollutants and contaminants. And what if somebody calls me out and then says, you don't have the right background? Because I felt that I didn't have the right background. But I said yes once again for the challenge. And I'm very happy that I said yes, because sociologists have a place in this, just like environmental scientists. And over the past several years, I've been tuning the importance of interdisciplinary scholarship and interdisciplinary advocacy and interdisciplinary work in general around environmental racism. Right now, it's very much confined to those who are environmental scientists, and we need to make room for people in different departments, people in different disciplines who have different expertise, from political science to health people to sociologists to geographers. What I've learned over the years doing this project is that it's extremely interdisciplinary, and we need to approach it that way.
Right, exactly. I remember going to an online conference last year on disaster risk reduction and hearing engineers and city planners just talking webinar after webinar. And I kept thinking, where are the sociologists here? Yes. So there's a lot of room, a lot of space. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm just wondering, how is environmental racism different from the term that we've heard in recent years, environmental justice?
Well, certainly in Canada, I would say more so than the States, the two terms are kind of used interchangeably, although I would say it's very rare that you hear people using the term, whether it be scholars or others, environmental racism, but they do use the term environmental justice. And when I started this project, I said, well, what's the difference? Why are they using environmental justice? Where is the justice in this? If every article that I read uses the term environmental justice, but the whole article focuses on the injustice of these communities that experience the disproportionate siting of industries in their communities, then where is the justice? So I thought that's a strange term to call it environmental justice. And I said to myself, well, environmental justice is the goal. It's the intended outcome. It's the thing that we want to achieve. But before we look at what the approach is to achieve the goal of environmental justice, we need to actually look at the problem. We need to spend time on the problem. We've got to figure out what's causing the problem. So it's not just me who says that, but when I read scholarship, particularly in the States, there are some scholars like Dr. Bullard in Texas who talks about the distinction that environmental racism is the condition, it's the illness, it's the problem of the disproportionate siting. Environmental justice then must be informed by the condition of environmental racism. For example, the bill that I helped develop, the legislation with Lenore Zan, well, it didn't become legislation, let's call it a private member's bill, that's what it is. That is an approach to justice. You know, the bill was developed in order to bring together key government players to form a committee to address environmental racism. So that's environmental justice, trying to identify and create legal tools that would address the condition of environmental racism, right? So it's similar, I always say this to people, it's similar to if you go to your doctor. When you go to your doctor, you want a diagnosis. You're probably not going to want to take the medication or the pills that he prescribes until he tells you what the diagnosis is. And then once you hear the diagnosis and maybe the causal factors for the illness that you have, he's then going to determine the best approach to deal with the illness that you have. And he might prescribe certain types of medication and not other types of medication based on the illness that you have. So I see environmental racism in the same way. The disproportionate siting overwhelmingly of these industries in racialized communities is an illness, is the condition, is the problem. And based on the causal factors, in other words, based on the reasons why these industries are being placed in these communities, based on an environmental assessment that's done, then we need to figure out the approach that we need to use in order to achieve and bring about justice in the future. So that is how I distinguish between the two.
Right. You've explained that very clearly. Now, in recent years, a lot of people, we are becoming aware of systemic racism, whether it's in Canada or in other countries. And how does environmental racism fit into the big picture of systemic racism? And I know in your book on page 17, you wrote a big list of the other factors that happen with systemic racism. For example, high unemployment rates, income insecurity, poverty, food insecurity, poorly resourced neighborhoods, etc. So I'm just wondering how environmental racism, like almost as if it's like a piece of the bigger puzzle.
Yes. As you're aware, you know, there's this term called intersectionality is being used a lot, and it came out of work from primarily Black feminists in the late 1980s who said, well, you know, if we're going to talk about issues and experiences, we need to talk about the intersection of race, gender, class, socioeconomic status, culture, citizenship status, disability, and age. Because, for example, a Black woman like myself, Ingrid Waldron, my experience is very different from somebody who may not have the same socioeconomic status, the same educational level, the same cultural background, right? So there are Black women, but Black women have different experiences based on those intersections. So intersectionality is key when we talk about systemic racism, because we understand that people's experiences are different. So when we even move further and we talk about unemployment and income insecurity and food insecurity, we also understand that environmental racism plays out within the context of those social issues, right? So, for example, as I said earlier, when we look at the communities that are disproportionately impacted by environmental racism, they tend to be not only racialized or non-white, they're also low income at the same time. That intersects with their race. They're also of particular cultural backgrounds. They also live in, so this is geography, they live in certain areas. And what else? They often suffer from food insecurity and housing insecurity. So what a lot of, I think, environmental science does not do is to situate and contextualize environmental racism within its proper social context. Environmental racism doesn't happen. It manifests out of the social fabric of a particular community. It manifests out of that, and it has been manifesting out of that since the colonial era. So we need to understand the social backdrop for environmental racism, how it manifests. For example, if if we think about high income, elite or middle class white communities, it's highly unlikely that these projects would be placed in those communities because those communities have social power, economic power, and political power. They would make their voices heard, just like Indigenous and Black communities, but they would be more likely to be heard. And action would be taken probably more quickly, as we've seen in the past. So we must situate environmental racism within its social context and understand, for example, the reasons why an industry may be placed in a community that is dealing with food insecurity and housing insecurity and racism and other issues, because those issues tend to weaken the social fabric of these communities, making it much more difficult for these communities to fight back. When you're distracted by social, economic, and political disadvantages, like, for example, some Indigenous communities are, you're distracted. It's very hard for you to take on as well the issue of environmental racism because you're trying to address so many other social ills in your community, right? So environmental racism is enabled, it manifests out of the social fabric of particular communities that are chosen precisely because government knows that these communities will have a harder time fighting back because of the social, political, economic challenges that they already face. So we need an intersectional analysis on environmental racism. We need to intersect the social with the science, with the contaminants and pollutants, and ask questions about why particular communities, what's the social backdrop in that particular community. If that community does want to fight back against environmental racism, what tools are they lacking to do that, and what resources are they lacking to do that precisely because of social, economic, and political disadvantages?
Right. Now, there's another term that's become popular in recent years. It's called social determinants of health. But in the book, in your preface, you said you prefer to use the word structural determinants of health. So I'm just wondering, why did you choose that?
Yeah, there's a bit of a subtle, or maybe not so subtle, distinction between the two. I mean, certainly health scholars for the past 20 years in Canada have been using the term social determinants of health to talk exactly what I've talked, to discuss exactly what I mentioned earlier, to understand that illness is an outcome of social context more so than genetics and biology. So at one point, I used to point my students to the Health Canada website. I'm not sure if it's still there, but there's a pie chart, or there used to be a pie chart that showed that genetics and biology had a kind of minuscule contributory factor with respect to illness and disease. And the other social issues outside the body played a larger role in illness and disease. Things like food security, poverty, socioeconomic insecurity, race, culture, all of these issues played a larger role. These are things that are outside the body. They played a larger role in illness than genetics and biology. So a lot of people would say, in the past, well, my mother had cancer, so I may have a higher risk of getting cancer. We now know that's not necessarily the case. We now know that cancer and other chronic diseases are actually an outcome of chronic stressors in our body. So when we're under stress, our cortisol level raises, and that actually predisposes us to a number of chronic diseases like cancer and like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. The causes for those diseases are outside the body primarily. It doesn't mean that genetics and biology do not play some role, but they play much less of a role than the social context that I talked about earlier. So it is an important concept, social determinants of health, and I haven't kind of dismissed it from my vocabulary. But over the past few years, I've been reading about the structural determinants of health. And what I like about that is that it goes deeper. It takes those social determinants of health, like gender, culture, race, socioeconomic status, poverty, and it situates it within policy. And that's how it goes deeper. Because if you just stay on the surface level, which is saying that race is a determinant of health, racism specifically is a determinant of health and can cause illness, as we know now, Then we need to go a bit further to say racism where, right? We situate it within our social structures in Canada. So racism within, for example, the criminal justice system and the criminal justice policies that we see. Racism within the education system, which is a structure, and the educational policies that often create challenges, for example, for Black students to succeed. Racism within employment that often results in racialized and Black people having challenges getting employment or contributing to underemployment in the Black community. So the structural determinants of health focuses on our social structures, education, employment, labor, immigration, criminal justice, housing, and other public infrastructure issues, and says that it's the policies and the decisions that are made by people within those social structures that then on the ground impact people of color, right? So when we think of environmental racism specifically, we know that the policies and decisions in departments of environment across Canada will impact people on the ground. So whoever gets to make a decision about where a landfill goes, right, who is typically, the person who does that is typically a member of the middle class, upper middle class, typically looks a certain way, typically white, certainly doesn't look like me. When we go into any NGO, ENGOs or departments of environment across Canada, the people in top decision-making, who have top decision-making power, are not racialized people. So they get to make those environmental policies. They get to decide how an environmental assessment runs. And those policies and decisions, like environmental policies and environmental assessments, then shape what happens outside departments of environment and then have impacts on the ground on people of color. So that's what structural determinants of health does. It takes those social determinants. It doesn't stay on the surface level. It takes them and it contextualizes them within our social structures. And those social structures are responsible for making policies and decisions. And those policies and decisions then have impacts on the ground as they impact primarily people of color, Indigenous people, often in very negative ways.
Right. That sounds like a whole university course just right there.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, we're thinking about creating that course here at McMaster that I would teach sometime in the future, actually.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. Well, you've unpacked it in a short and concise way, in a very a good way to make it understandable. So
great.
Now, so you talked a bit about the Enrich project and then how you got into it. And then I'm just wondering, so how did this multi-year project play a role in making the book, which was very wonderful? I've been reading different chapters of it. It's very extensive. And then the documentary, which is very different from the book. So how did the Enrich project kind of inform the book and the documentary?
Well, I had always planned sometime in the future to perhaps write a book, but I wasn't ready to do it. I actually had some plans for other types of books. I was thinking about a book about the challenges I experienced doing community-based research in Nova Scotia as an outsider. That's actually what I was thinking about. And I had mentioned that to Fernwood Publishing, who did publish my book. When I sat down with the publisher, that would be Easter of 2015. And I said, here's a book that I am proposing. I want to talk about the challenges I've experienced as a researcher and an outsider in Nova Scotia. And he said, no, I would actually prefer you to do a book on environmental racism, taking from your Enrich project. And I want you to provide historical context to it. And I also want you to focus on both communities, the Indigenous communities and Black communities. And I said to myself, okay, I wasn't really thinking of doing this yet, but this seems interesting. And, over the years, I have been taking notes. I have like a monthly newsletter. I used to, a monthly newsletter that I would send out to the people on my email list about what the Enrich project is up to. I would send that every single month without fail. So it was kind of like a bit of a diary, and I was keeping all these notes, and I had all the dates, and everything was accurate. So I said, you know what? I can go back to those notes. I can just plunk it into an MS Word document and then start refining everything. So in a way, it was easy for me because I was documenting everything since 2012, when the publisher asked me to write the book in 2015. So that's how it came about. The publisher had been attending many of the events that I held that was organized by the Enrich Project on environmental racism. Over the years, like I used to put on a lot of events in Nova Scotia, and he was always sitting there. And as most publishers would do, they're probably always thinking about what would make a good book. That's what they do, right? They want to sell books, and he's always been attending my events, and he's probably thinking, this could make a good book. So that's how that happened. In terms of the documentary, well, after the book was published in spring of 2018, I was doing the typical book launches. And then in, I would say, October or November of 2018, I noticed that my Twitter page was extremely active. One of my Twitter pages, my Enriched Twitter page, which is typically not very active. And, I woke up one morning and I noticed that I had a new follower by the name of Elliott Page, and didn't connect that name with the actor whose films I had seen over the years. So I didn't think anything about it. I don't even think I followed him back. And I went about my business. A few months later, I went back to the Twitter page and said, this is really active. This page is never active. And then I noticed comments from this person by the name of Elliott Page saying, you've got to get Ingrid's book. This book is fantastic. It's a great book on environmental racism. We need to support the communities, going on and on. I'm like, is this the actor? And why would an actor, any actor, be reaching out to me? Mm-hmm. And I didn't know that Elliott Page was like an activist in any way. So it didn't really seem to make sense. So I realized eventually that it was the actor. I was kind of flabbergasted. And I thought, well, the polite thing to do is to DM him and thank him, because he's giving me free publicity, and helping to sell the books. I said, I've got to thank him. So I did. And he wrote back. And in a few weeks, there was a three-way phone call between myself, Elliott Page, and Elliott Page's friend in Halifax, a friend of Elliott Page, I guess for the past 15 years at that point, who's also the owner of a restaurant. Actually, she set up the meeting. She said, Ingrid, I've known Elliott Page for 15 years. Do you want me to set up a phone call? I said, of course, please do. So we did do that at the end of December in 2018. And we had another three-way phone call in January of 2019, this time with members of the Indigenous community that you see in the film, the grassroots grandmothers. There were about 3 of them on the line. And we were just kind of trying to think about ways to raise awareness about environmental racism. We were not thinking about a film of this kind. What we did come up with was perhaps, creating short videos, 10-minute videos that we can post on Twitter to raise awareness. That's really it. We weren't thinking of anything more than that. So Elliott Page came up to Nova Scotia in April and filmed all of us, everybody that you see, or most people that you see in the film. And then I said, when I was looking at cuts of the film, I said, you know what? I don't think 10-minute video clips will do this topic justice. I said, if we really want to create awareness and we really want to do something about it, I think we need a feature-length film. I think it should be about 70 minutes. And the co-director, Ian Daniel, said, really, you think that? I said, yeah. And I said, let's go even further than that. I think this should be screened at the Toronto International Film Festival. It's the most important film festival in the world. Everybody comes. If we screen it there, it's going to get, the topic will get there will be substantial awareness about environmental racism, not just in Canada, but around the world. I think this is what we should do. And we should also think about, the Berlin Film Festival and all these other film festivals. And they said, okay, let's see if we can submit it to TIFF. And we did. And they accepted it. And we were September 9th screening the film at TIFF, and then found out later, probably around October, that it was accepted for Netflix. And it started streaming on Netflix March of 2020, like a few weeks after the pandemic hit, which was kind of the pandemic was certainly horrible, but it allowed people to spend more time watching television and watching Netflix. And I think, you can get so distracted by so many television shows and so many programs on Netflix. And I think because people were watching television more and Netflix more, it gave people an opportunity to really find the film. And the response has really, really been great from people around the world about how inspiring the women in the film are. So I'm very pleased with how it came out. It's very rough, as you can see. It's a rough film. It was never meant for Netflix. It was never really meant for Toronto International Film Festival. And I like the fact that it's pretty rough and it's not glossy, but it's honest.
Right. One thing I could say is that documentary is very memorable. There's so many scenes in there. It just kind of sticks in the mind, right?
Wow.
Yeah. So especially now, there's two groups in there that you kind of focus on, the Mikmaq and the African Nova Scotians. And I'm from the West Coast, so it's just like, it's kind of like learning about a totally different country. It's like, what, 6 or 7 hour, I don't know, a plane ride. It's pretty far. Yep. And it's like, wow, I didn't really know about it. And then it was featuring the Mikmaq community there. It was Picto's Landing First Nation, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so
two communities, actually. So the Mikmaq people are the founding Indigenous peoples of Nova Scotia.
Okay.
Pictou Landing First Nation, they're one of the Mi'kmaq communities there. But the women that you see in the film who refer to themselves as the grassroots grandmothers, they're from another community. They're from Sabaganagati First Nation. So these are the six women sitting in a circle talking. You saw one woman confronting our prime minister when he came out of his car. So that's the community called Sabaganagati First Nation, and they have been resisting a brine discharge pipeline that Alton Gas wants to install or implement in their community. Then you've got Pictou Landing First Nation. The person featured in the film is Michelle Francis Denny, and that community has had a toxic site, which is Boat Harbor, since 1967, when the pulp mill has been dumping effluent into that site. So they've been dealing with that since 1967, and certainly I would say mostly in the 1980s, they started to challenge it. Perhaps before then as well, but in 1980s, the government made a lot of broken promises, that they would address it, that they would close the mill. And the mill was finally closed in January of 2020.
Right. And I think it's very important to see the emotional impact in the film, which if you just read a news article, you don't get that. But yes. I really remember being impacted by that. Yes. Now, you also featured the African Nova Scotians, and it was interesting to read up the long history and the varied history of those different communities. I'm just wondering, what was the environmental racism happening there?
African Nova Scotian communities are the oldest Black community in Canada. They've been in Canada for over 300 years. So very different from other Black communities across Canada. Most live in isolated, less so now, but isolated areas. So earlier I talked about isolated areas, out of the way places, how easy it is to put and environmentally dangerous projects in communities that you think will not fight back. And African Nova Scotians, I would say that there are 3 or 2 communities that I've been dealing with that have been experiencing environmental racism. Or let me say 3 communities. So first there's Africville, and that's a historical Black community. There are still, of course, descendants of Africville living, but the community of Africville is no longer. And this community dealt with both gentrification and environmental racism back in the early 1960s. The city of Halifax decided to push the community out to make way for, condos and industrial development, and they needed the community to get out. So they pushed them out. They expropriated them. But in addition to expropriating the community, there were various kind of environmental hazards left in the wake of industrial development. And that included a tar factory, cotton factory, railway system, a prison system, and an open dump. So they had to contend with both being pushed out of their community and environmental hazards. And even though the community, in terms of place, is no longer, the residents still would say that that experience is traumatic. And over the years, they have risen up, they continue to do so, to demand reparations from the government for the fallout, the economic fallout, the fact that they lost their homes and were pushed out. They've been seeking reparations, financial compensation from the Nova Scotia government for quite a few years, and that hasn't happened as yet, but they keep going. So even though it's a historical case, I still see it as a present day case because the community is still looking for redress. The communities that I have been dealing with more closely would be Lincolnville and Shelburne. Shelburne was featured in the film. Shelburne is a community that has had a landfill since 1943. Everything, they would say everything went into that dump. Syringes from the hospital, medical waste, waste from the military base, like everything went in there. And they have extremely high rates of cancer. I would say perhaps over 90% rate of cancer. When I met with the woman featured in the film, Louise DeLille, I was shocked when she said to me, pretty much everyone in my community has cancer. And I thought, well, that's stunning. That's a stunning statement. And I found it hard to believe. But lo and behold, I've known her since 2015. And, we are on Facebook. We are Facebook friends. And I can't tell you the amount of time she contacts me through Facebook to tell me another person died. I mean, that was happening weekly. I don't know if it's still happening. I think perhaps she just doesn't want to let me know because it's depressing. But I was stunned by the amount of people who just keep dying in her community. And when I asked her, what are they dying from? She says cancer. And they have done a lot. I mean, led by Louise over the years, since 2015, when I first met her, to address that dump. What was really kind, when I think about Elliott Page was kind to gift the community a community well. In April of 2019, when Elliott Page went to Halifax to do the filming, she mentioned to me while we were walking, I think I'm going to buy Shelburne a community well. I think I'm going to buy the Black community a community well for the community because in addition to environmental racism, they're on well water, and well water tends to be more contaminated. So I'm going to buy a well just for that community. And I said to her, that is really kind. I think you've done enough though, and you don't need to do this. And he said, nope, I'm going to buy the community a well. And he did. And they have been fighting their local government to install that well since April of last year. So the kind of racism this community has faced, the environmental racism, but also the disregard for their humanity, their local government's disregard for their humanity by not responding to requests for meetings about when that community well gifted by Elliott Page will be installed in the community. They had to fight, and they continue to fight their government to have that well installed because the response by their government early on was, if we put it in the Black community, they're never going to use it. So let's put it in the North End. The North End is primarily white. The South End is primarily Black. So that to me is just obvious example of racism when you have no respect for a community. These are your constituents, and you refuse to meet with them to discuss when that well will be installed. And this was a gift by Elliott Page. I also dealt with Lincolnville. Lincolnville is not featured in the movie, but they have had a landfill since 1974. And again, 2006, or was it 2009, a second generation landfill was put on top of the first generation landfill from 1974. So the contaminated water from the second generation landfill has been seeping in to the water from the 1974 landfill. The community also says high rates of cancer, and they're concerned, of course, about the link between that well and high rates of cancer and other diseases. While that landfill, I don't think will ever be redirected, and that's what the community wants. They would say, we want the government to redirect it someplace else, but we don't want it in our community. To be honest, I don't think that's going to ever happen. I mean, they've been fighting this since 1974. So realizing that that may never happen, through the Enrich project and a hydrogeologist and environmental science students that I recruited back in 2016, we did the first water testing project in Lincolnville. We thought that they needed to know what was in their water, because that's one of the things they always wanted to know. What is in our water? What contaminants are in our water? But we don't want the government to tell us, because we don't trust the government. We don't want to ask the government what's in the water. We don't want the government to do the water testing because we don't trust them. They're probably going to tell us everything is okay. So we thought, okay, well, the Enrich project is independent of government, and we're going to be honest. So I got together a team in 2016, including the hydrogeologist, including, as I said, some environmental science students, myself, and we decided that we're going to do a project that will test their water. We did that. We wrote a report. We were able to share what contaminants are in their water, and we advised them on how to treat their water or handle or manage their water supply. Because many of them talked about just feeling ill, right? Feeling ill, stomach aches, and gastrointestinal issues. So that's what we were able to do for that community in light of the fact that that landfill will never be redirected, I don't believe.
Right. Now, at the end of your book and also at the end of the documentary, there are images of resistance, mobilizing, and activism from Indigenous and Black communities. And I'm just wondering what kinds of these activities are happening in the fight against environmental racism?
I think they're important actions. I think what resistance, mobilizing, and activism does, it brings attention to any issue. You know, think about the Black Lives Matter movement. It's worldwide, it has brought increasingly over the years attention to anti-Black police violence. So these kind of street marches, protest movements, mobilizing, organizing, advocacy are great to bring attention to an issue. And Indigenous communities and Black communities have been engaged in mobilizing and activism for decades to bring attention to the issue of environmental racism. But I always say that that's not enough. That mobilizing has to go hand in hand with policy, which is why I've been trying to get legislation passed on environmental racism, first in Nova Scotia, starting in 2015, and again this year, last year, as you probably know, with the federal environmental racism bill. But although both have gone to second reading, they haven't gone any further. In the case of this most recent bill, it's because an election was called. Whenever an election is called, private members' bills are wiped off the table, and you got to start from the beginning, unfortunately. But so I always say that mobilizing is important, and certainly, you know, I admire the communities, Black and Indigenous communities, that have been staunchly, persistently involved in mobilizing. I find it amazing how strong they are and that they never give up. They're like, they're just like the Energizer Bunny, I guess I would say. They keep going and going and going. And as they continue to do that, they raise awareness in the media. You know, these mobilizing activities get attention by journalists, and it raises awareness. And when you raise awareness, you create empathy. You know, people don't know about an issue like they didn't know about environmental racism. Many people didn't know about environmental racism when I started. They would say, "What's that?" And they thought, "Well, I can't believe that that's happening. Why would the environment be racist?" And everybody was very doubtful about what I was saying. But as you continue to create awareness, people then become more empathic, right? So you can't expect them to have empathy if they don't understand the issue. So I do believe activism is important, but it's only part of the equation. We've got to find champions. We've got to find, as I have, champions in government who are willing to take a risk and to put themselves out there and to create policy and legislation that would demand that government address a particular issue, because that creates transparency, right? Which is the case of the environmental racism bill. Lenore Zan is the politician, first the MLA, more recently the MP, who has been championing a bill or a legislation with me since 2015. And that's what you need. You've got to find a politician who is a champion. Unfortunately, Lenore lost her seat, which is incredibly disappointing.
Oh, too bad.
She lost her seat with this federal election, and she was my government champion. I don't know any other person who has been a champion like her around environmental racism. So my task is to now find a new champion in the Liberal Party. She was Liberal. So she lost her seat and lost her job, unfortunately. So I'm at a place where I need to figure things out. But that is key to me. So mobilizing, yes, important. Policy, just as important and perhaps more important. And then I think education is really important. We've got to get at the young people. The people in power now in departments of environment across Canada are people who probably did not benefit from an education that taught them about systemic racism, systemic discrimination, environmental racism. I know that they didn't get this education because I'm very familiar with the Nova Scotia educational system and in general Canadian educational system, where issues of racism and systemic inequalities are rarely touched on, right? So we need to get at the young people who are our future leaders, the 14-year-olds who are interested in climate change and environmental issues, and give them a different framework, a different type of analysis, so that when they get into positions of power in departments of environment or other departments or ENGOs, they have a different and a better and a stronger analysis of how environmental racism manifests and what needs to be done in order to address it. So I think those three things: education, getting at the young people, the future leaders, giving them a different type of framework and analysis, mobilizing activism, and third, legislation are key to addressing environmental racism.
Right. That's awesome. Now, you mentioned empathy, and there was this quote you had given in the book from, I think it was Joe Fagan and Hernan Vera on white racism. And as a white person, whenever I see these kind of quotes, it's kind of like a big hand that grabs me by the face. And it said, white racism involves a massive breakdown of empathy. And I had done a podcast on the opioids crisis, and the speaker had mentioned that it's the same thing. It's a breakdown of empathy. So I just thought that if you want to solve this problem, you have to retrieve and regain the empathy. So, and I believe that you've kind of given some specific actions, how that empathy can sort of be fleshed out into real life. Isn't that right?
I mean, what do you think about the quote as a white person?
Well, I mean, I've spent like 13 plus years reading about Indigenous history. And then this past year during the pandemic, I've personally have tried to find out of the African diaspora experience. So I did a lot of reading, watched documentaries, and then it's kind of like you've got to reschool yourself after, because your elementary and high school or even university didn't do it. So that's why when you said education is important, but education, it can't just happen as a quick thing. It has to go deep, right?
Yes.
And so I'm hoping that the people that are like even new in these government departments and in industry and who are in the university can get something that's not just a workshop, that they can kind of go in depth and they can listen to people who are Indigenous or Black Canadians and really hear the experience. And I think that's why the documentary was powerful, because it put a face to all these kind of abstract terms.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what the quote is saying, and I really think that's a fantastic quote, that it's difficult for all of us, but white people have power. So let me just focus on white people. It's difficult for white people, I think, at times, I'm not going to say every white person, to empathize with people who don't look like them. I kind of liken this to the recent events with that young woman in the United States whose boyfriend killed her, which is all over the media. And oftentimes when I watch television shows, they said, well, this Black person went missing and this Indigenous person went missing. Why is it that the media is so focused on these issues when a young white blonde girl goes missing, right? Because people were captivated by this young woman's story recently in the media. Now she was found dead. Her boyfriend killed her. And we see these cases all the time, but it's typically the white young girl who the media focuses on. And I was watching a program, and the person in the program said, yes, it's very difficult. One of the reasons why we don't focus on the young Black girl who goes missing and dies is because it's very difficult for white people to empathize with people who just don't look like them. And I think it's the same with environmental racism or with any topic in general, is that, empathizing with or understanding the challenges of a racial outgroup, a group that's not your group, is often difficult for people to do. And it's difficult for many people to do. We're kind of like tribes. We're focused on our own group. But the difference is that Indigenous people and Black people don't hold the power. So when you focus on a white girl in the media, you're giving power to that. The people who have power are able to leverage that or exploit that, and people have empathy, and everybody's sorry about it because the media, people in power, chose a particular type of person to feature. And that actually hampers the ability for police and others to find missing young Black girls, for example, or missing young Black boys, because they're so focused on white people. So it does damage when you don't focus on other groups, when you're trying to find missing and murdered individuals. So we all do that. We are all part of tribes. We all perhaps care about our own group if we're honest. All of us, Black people do, Indigenous people, if we're honest, we know that we care about our own group. But the difference is, once again, racialized people don't have power. So I really think that's the case with environmental racism. But over the years in Nova Scotia, I see young white allies. I'm impressed with, I can only speak for Nova Scotia, but, in kind of meeting with the Indigenous community and going up to their community to get some education, which I did, who is there? It's the young white environmental activists who are there, who are eager to learn. So I'm very hopeful with this young generation. They're not faking it. I've met them. They keep going up to the Indigenous communities. They want to learn. They're taking part in workshops. They're contributing when they can. And those are the individuals that I meet. I am obviously in a bubble, because environmental racism is a specific bubble in a way. But I am seeing young white individuals really engaged in this topic, really wanting to help, engaging themselves with Indigenous communities, trying to learn about these issues, holding events, in Nova Scotia, in Canada, about truth and reconciliation issues. They really want to learn. So I'm really, really hopeful with this new generation that they're going to have a different framework, once again, a different analysis.
Right. And so today, we can't forget this. This is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, September the 30th. And it's actually the first one ever in Canada. So it's quite a historical day. Mm-hmm. And now, Ingrid, I'm wondering, what are your other irons in the fire? I know you've actually had a big move from Nova Scotia now to the province of Ontario. So now it's kind of like a new phase, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, the Enrich Project has focused on Nova Scotia because that's where it began. But as I've moved to McMaster, I said to myself, I want to broaden this. Not only am I broadening the communities that I want to look at, because McMaster and being in Ontario provides me with a bigger platform. But even before I made the move and before I found out I got the job at McMaster, which was in January of this year, I actually co-founded an environmental racism coalition late last year, before I found out I got hired at McMaster, with a colleague, with a partner in Ontario. We're working on the name right now, but it's probably going to be called the Canadian Coalition for Environmental and Climate Justice. And since last year, we've been able to bring together over 50 organizations in the environmental and climate change sectors to come together to share resources and expertise to address environmental racism across Canada, so not just Nova Scotia. And we have brought together big players: David Suzuki Foundation, Eco Justice, Environmental Law Association, Canadian Environmental Law Association, Climate Hub in different cities, Climate Action Network, on and on, some really big players in the environmental and climate change field. So I've expanded because I'm in Ontario. There are more communities here that I want to get to know. I've expanded from Nova Scotia to across Canada with this new coalition. But also, I just have a bigger scope now. I'm also engaging in climate change more. I really, in Nova Scotia, I was exclusively focused, I would say, on polluting industries. And as climate change has become, increasingly important, that's what everybody's talking about. I said, I got to get my act together and I got to do more on climate change, which I started to do in March of this year when I held a climate change adaptation workshop in Shelburne, the Black community that was featured in the film. So that was my first kind of few steps getting into the climate change field. So with the coalition, with my job at McMaster, now I want to look more at climate change inequities. How are Indigenous and Black people impacted by climate change in very specific ways because of social context? There's really not a lot on this topic, surprisingly. I found that out earlier this year when I contacted so many different universities, specifically with respect to Black populations. And I said, is any professor doing any work on climate change in Black communities? And the answer was no. And certainly there's that work in Indigenous communities, but I also want to focus on what Black communities are experiencing around climate change as well. So I've really broadened in many ways, and there's so much more work to do, which is extremely exciting for me.
Wow. That sounds like you have a lot on the go. Yes. So I'm wondering, Ingrid, what is the last message that you have for the audience that you'd like to leave ringing in their ears?
Well, you brought up the issue of systemic racism earlier. What I would say to individuals who are involved in climate change, climate justice work, environmental racism, environmental justice work, is that addressing environmental racism must go hand in hand with addressing other racial inequities. You cannot just do one and not the other, right? I talked about how we have to situate the topic or the issue of environmental racism and climate change inequities within the larger social context in terms of how those environmental inequities manifest out of the social, economic, and political fabric of any community. So if you're planning to work on the issue of climate change, you must also work on the issue of racism. You must also work on the issue of capitalism. You must also work on the issue of colonialism, or today as we call it, settler colonialism. These issues go hand in hand. You cannot deal with these issues independent of the other. So that is my last message. Any action that's going to address environmental racism or climate change that doesn't address also racial justice at the same time will fall short, particularly if you know that the communities that are most impacted by these environmental issues are non-white or racialized communities. If you are doing that work without an appreciation for racial justice and what that means and intersectionality, your work will fall short. That is my message.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. That is very powerful. Dr. Ingrid Waldron, thank you so much for participating in this episode's conversation, and have a wonderful day.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that's it. This conversation was an eye-opener. Thanks to our esteemed guest, Dr. Ingrid Waldron, for being here at today's Multi-Hazards podcast. And an important disclaimer here. First, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific professional or expert advice unless otherwise noted. Second, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that either my guests or I are working with. So, here as I conclude this episode, thanks to all of you respected listeners for listening in today to our podcast. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.